Hi, and welcome to chapter, let's see where we're at now, 24. And we're going to do learning objective 4. I already recorded this once in PowerPoint and it did not want to export. So we're going to go ahead and do this. And let me share my screen with you. Let's see. Share screen. Here we go. And bam. Okay. So let me bring up one other thing over here. Okay, there we go. I just want to get some ink color here. There we go. Okay, so we're going to look at how the government affects the loanable funds market. Okay, and so we're going to look at some specific policies that they use. So remember that the loanable funds market, let me grab this, move this. Like I said, this is like the fourth time I've done this, so hopefully it'll be a lot better. Okay, so remember here we have the loanable funds market. We have the interest rate along the y-axis, and we have the loanable funds along the x-axis. The supply of loanable funds comes from national savings. Oh, stop that. Okay. Comes from national savings. And when we reorganized the national income account, said that national savings is equal to GDP, less consumption, less government spending. And then we broke that national savings down into the private savings, which is done by households, and public savings. Okay, so the private savings we said was GDP, less taxes, less consumption. And if we add that together with public savings, taxes, minus government expenditures, that's how we get the national savings. Also remember, it's positively sloped because the higher the interest rate, the more people will want to save. So really what the savers want is a high interest rate. You said in a closed economy that the demand for loanable funds is investment. Things like people wanting to buy additional machinery for their business, things like that. And here, the demand is negatively sloped. Why? Because people who are investing in their business, they would prefer a lower interest rate. You can think of it this way. If they're going to get a loan, they want a lower interest rate, right? So here we have the interest rate, and we'll call that interest equilibrium at 5%. We have the quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium at 60. So what the government might do is to target specifically these savers, okay, these individuals that want to save. And so one of the policies that they might use is to use a tax incentive. So a tax incentive would be things such as, let's imagine that you put $1,000 into a savings account and it pays 10% interest rate. So at the end of that period, we'll just say one period, you have $100, and that's considered a gain. If the tax rate for the government is, let's say 30%, that means that you're going to pay 30% of that gain, or $30 is going to go to the government, and you get to keep the remaining $70. Okay, goes to the household. Now, how the government might end up manipulating, but I'm not using manipulating in kind of a bad way here. What I'm saying is how they might manipulate this process is they may say, hey, savers, we're going to let you keep more. So instead of that tax rate being 30%, let's say instead it's 20%. In this scenario, then you would pay $20 to the government and you would keep $80 as a household. And I say keep, we would really want you to save that in this particular perspective. So basically, the other portion of this is that people might save more than $1,000 if they get to keep more of it. So by reducing the capital gains tax, that's the example I'm using here, then what happens is The national savings, because of private savings, will increase. So private's going to increase, which will make national savings increase, which shifts the supply of loanable funds outward and to the right. That's an increase. Okay, let's see what the effect of that is. Well, now when we look at equilibrium, where the quantity of loanable funds demanded equals the quantity of loanable funds supplied, we have a lower interest rate. I'll just say 4%. So the second effect is the interest rate will go down. Okay. The third and final effect is that the quantity of loanable funds, I'll just put 80, the quantity of loanable funds will increase. Now notice that the government was targeting savers here, but let's look at the net effect after all of this shift happens in the loanable funds market. What happens is that people who are on the investment side, those people wanting loanable funds are actually getting a lower interest rate. So it kind of helps this side of the market, even though it was targeted at national savings as a savings incentive. Now, the other thing we want to do to make sure that we're doing this appropriately for economic context is we're going to say that the supply of loanable funds will shift out, the interest rate will go down, the quantity of loanable funds will increase with tax incentives holding all else constant. Or if you want, just say certus paribus, Latin for all else held constant. And that makes us really kind of absolutely correct from an economic context. Okay. So let me clean that slide and show you just kind of a little bit more. It reduces the interest rate, quantity of loanable funds. The last effect here is what we see is savings, national savings is going to be greater than investment. And we're going to set that aside for right now, but we're going to return to it when we open back up this economy to kind of talk about, well, what happens if people aren't saving at home? And we're going to see that a lot of that savings will go abroad. Okay. The government can also use investment incentives, and this targets the demand for loanable funds here. Investment incentives may be that they want to encourage individuals to get loans. So it might be that they provide a tax rebate. And you'll see that a lot of green energy right now is subject to a tax rebate. So if you put in solar panels, for example, you might get a rebate on your taxes if you're a household, okay? So these tax rebates are targeted specifically at individuals that are considering the opportunity cost of putting in solar panels. It's pretty expensive, but if they're able to get that back on their taxes, also able to sell that energy back to the grid, then what we're going to see is they're going to be more likely to engage in those types of activities. So basically what will happen here is people will get loans for green energy, more energy efficient types of appliances perhaps, or things like that. And that's going to shift the demand for loanable funds out here to the right. The effect of that we're going to see is that the interest rate will increase. I'll just say 8%. Okay, so the interest rate is going to increase. The quantity of loanable funds is likewise going to increase. I'll say 75. So quantity of loanable funds increases. And we can see that because the government is declaring this tax rebate, we end up at a higher interest rate. We end up with greater quantity of loanable funds, and again, an increase in the demand or investment in the economy. Okay, now I'll clean this up and we'll just look at it drawn a lot better than what I do. And so there we are, higher interest rate, higher quantity of loanable funds. And again, we see greater saving and investment here at both, because again, they started here with investment. But notice that savers, remember, they want a high interest rate. And so they're actually reaping some of the rewards of this government intervention. Okay, now remember that national savings is made up of the private savings by households plus public savings. Okay, so I'm just going to write the equations because we need to look at them quite a bit to make sure we remember them. So private GDP minus taxes minus consumption plus the public of taxes minus government expenditures. Now, in the previous one, I talked about the government influencing the private savings. Here, we're going to see by government action how and what happens to public savings. So we talked about before that public savings is basically taxes minus government expenditures. But public saving can actually be negative. And if it's negative, that means that the government has spent more than it brings in. So this creates a negative public saving. However, we have had moments in the past where we've had a budget surplus. And so therefore it will be positive, meaning public savings will be positive. Public savings. If it's balanced, what we bring in is what we spend, then we have a balanced budget. So why we talk about this is because if public saving is negative, then the government is actually using some of the household's private savings. And I say it's indirect, but it means if we say national savings equals investment, and if the government is running a deficit, that means there's less national savings because public savings becomes negative, which means there's less investment in the overall economy. So this is why many economists are very concerned about budget deficits. So let's look, and I pulled this up, from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, just to show you kind of where we're at today, because sometimes you're a little bit dated in terms of what's in your text. So today being July 2023. And as of today, the deficit was 220,782 million. So 220,782 million was the deficit right here in July 2023. This is reported monthly. It is not seasonally adjusted, and again, in millions of dollars. But what I really want to show you is that when this is the balanced budget, this is where taxes will equal government spending. Here's where anytime above this line up in here, this is where government spending has been greater than taxes. And anytime below this, we've had a surplus where taxes is greater than government spending. And I think you'll note this one right here when we talk about COVID. All right. Okay, so what would this look like in a problem scenario? So here's an example. Assume the government starts with a balanced budget, so taxes are equal to government spending. And then because of an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, starts running a deficit. Use a graph for loanable funds to analyze a deficit. We'll look at the changes, and then we're going to analyze a surplus. Okay, so I went ahead and drew a little graph here. And again, we're going to put the interest rate right here. And we'll put the quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis. I'll go ahead and draw a downward sloping demand curve for the demand for loanable funds, which we know in a closed economy is equal to investment. I'm going to go ahead and draw the supply of loanable funds, which is national savings, made up again of private plus public. Okay, so first one we want to analyze right here is a deficit. So here, public savings is negative. Okay. When public savings is negative, let me go ahead and get an interest rate in here. And we'll just stay with that 5%. That's equilibrium interest. And we'll say the quantity of loanable funds, we'll say 60 here. Billion. Okay. All right. So now the government runs a deficit. When the government runs a deficit, national savings decreases. When national savings decreases, it's going to shift the supply of loanable funds inward and to the left. And we'll have S1. So this is with a deficit. Okay. Now, what's the effect of that deficit? First of all, we'll come over here and look at the interest rate. Interest rates are going to increase. So interest increases, and the quantity of loanable funds decreases. That's the part we don't like. So when the quantity of loanable funds, let's say 50. So quantity loanable funds goes down. So the first effect here is that the public savings becomes negative, running a deficit. That shifts the supply of loanable funds inward and to the left. That's our second effect. Third effect is interest rates will go up. Fourth effect is the quantity of loanable funds will go down. We call this the crowding out effect. Because essentially, the deficit by the government has crowded out national savings. It shifted it inward, creating the increase in interest rate and the increase in the quantity of loanable funds. I'm sorry, the decrease in the quantity of loanable funds. All right, let's analyze a surplus. And again, we'll kind of start with a balanced budget here. So there's our demand for loanable funds investment. Here's our supply of loanable funds, national savings. And we're going to go ahead and start at that 5% interest rate, which is equilibrium. And we're going to say 60 billion quantity of loanable funds, and interest. Okay. So now we have public savings becoming a positive. When public savings is positive, that means that national savings is going to increase. In this case, it's going to shift outward and to the right to S2. The interest rate will decrease to 4%, let's say. So interest decreases. And the quantity of loanable funds increases. We kind of like anything where the quantity of loanable funds increases. You saw that with the first two government interventions here. So the quantity of loanable funds increases. So kind of a three-step process again. Let me change my ink color so we can just make sure that you have this. And again, we would say all else held constant here or other things equal. So first effect is we run a budget deficit. Second effect, national savings increases. Third effect, we see the shift, outward shift, increase in the quantity, the increase in the supply of loanable funds, which is national savings. So that's our third effect. Fourth effect is a decrease in the interest rate. Fifth and final effect is the quantity of loanable funds increases. Okay, let's see how we did. There's our crowding out effect where national savings decreases, which leads to a higher interest rate, which decreases the loanable funds. Budget surplus, we would see the opposite effect happening. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the history of government debt. I showed that to you. We often look at it as a measurement of debt to GDP. So if we stacked up all the debt and stacked up all the GDP, how would they compare. And a lot of people say, well, the US is terrible, but actually we're in a lot better position than some other countries are. And if you're interested in that, please look at FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, and ask, what is the government debt of Italy or government debt of Korea or Japan? Some of those are kind of interesting to look at. You'll find we're not that bad in comparison to other developed nations. So here again, this is a government debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product. Obviously, you could see wars will create more government debt, and as of late, COVID-19. I would like to turn our attention specifically to this one, the Great Recession. Now, notice we have the Great Depression. We don't say depression much anymore. We say the Great Recession. So the Great Recession happened over 10 years ago, but it still has implications in our economy today. So let me go ahead and stop the share here. And what I'd like to do is to show you a short video. It's short, 8 minutes, 40 some seconds or something, which is a PBS NewsHour clip that talks about the Great Recession 10 years later, kind of revisited. So I will see you in the next learning objective, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks.